Before we start on the Q&A, I have a couple of things that I want to let you know about. So obviously you're here because you're interested in AI and product management, and we have a few additional resources that I wanted to point you to. So first of all, we have a brand new AI for product management course that we have partnered with Pendo, Mind the Product, and Google Cloud to build you a self-paced online training course that you can take for free. So go ahead and check it out. We'd love to see as many of you taking that course as possible, and let us know what you think of it once you're done. And secondly, we also have an entire web practitioners in the field and brought it all together. So I think that's great. I'm still seeing some sounds gone comments. Are y'all able to hear me? Okay. So the link for that free course, we will put in the chat. So we'll get that there. It will also be included in the email that you get with the recording of the webinar. So hopefully my audio will hold up, but let's just get straight to the main event. So I'd like to introduce our special guest for today, Chris Butler. He is Group Product Manager for Machine Learning at Google, longtime product practitioner and friend of Mind the Product, and I'm so excited to be talking AI with you today.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Excellent. So Chris, can you start? Just tell us what you're doing with AI these days and at Google.
Absolutely. So I'm in the team that's called Core Machine Learning, which is basically the group that does a lot of different things with regards to machine learning, mostly focused on internal groups. And so we will help internal products adopt machine learning models or systems. So that would be like very applied type of stuff. We build out a lot of the frameworks and services that are used internally, but also externally. So some of the open source products, things like TensorFlow, TensorBoard, Keras, all those products come out of this group. And then finally, we do an awful lot of the kind of foundational work, which ends up being the systems and services, even compilers. So it can be a very esoteric and kind of technical world that we start to exist within. And we even go all the way down to kind of chip co-design because we end up building something called tensor processing units or TPUs, which are our version of accelerators that are like GPUs. And so basically this team covers all of that stuff, essentially, mostly focused to help internal people build things, but also some of that stuff gets outside. And then my focus now is on a very interesting project just around how do we make the use of these systems more effective and efficient, which, if we believe that it's hard to get accelerators right now for everybody. And so just how we use them ends up becoming really important. And so there's some really interesting work around that I'm doing. I've also worked an awful lot on kind of like PMing the PM experience inside of this team. I do a lot with the Learning Development Group at Google. I'm a G mentor, and then I'm also helping out with the next update to the People Plus AI guidebook, which is a really amazing resource for product people. If they get a chance to check it out, it's great especially for designers, because it's all about how do you build kind of interactions and design and UI for the way that people interact with non-deterministic systems. But we're now adding a bunch of stuff to also consider, like, how do product managers actually come into this conversation and help talk about trade-offs? And that's something we talk about an awful lot today, just about like how do product managers help with this. And so those are the things I do inside of Google. I also, like you said, I do a lot of writing and speaking outside. And also work on something called the Uncertainty Project, which is basically a community for strategy and decision making. So yeah, those are all the things we could talk about today. I have a bunch of other weird side projects going on, but those are the things that I do for the most part.
Great. So in the year since ChatGPT was introduced, it feels like AI is all anyone can talk about. And so in product, we're being asked to create an AI strategy for our products. We're also thinking about how we can use AI in product management ourselves. As someone who's been thinking about this for a long time before it was the hottest topic, how do you think that product managers should be thinking about AI?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And sorry, I didn't even talk about kind of the previous times, but when I was at a group called Philosophy, focused a lot on innovation in the AI space for large companies, worked for a company called IPsoft, working on conversational agents, worked at Facebook Reality Labs on the Portal device, focused on kind of identity biometric recognition and voice assist integration. So I've done this thing multiple times. And I guess the thing that I think just we start to realize, and I think maybe the story that I would tell is actually going all the way back when I was at Kayak, where we were just about to make the transition from really desktop web type of usage to mobile usage. And so I got hired on as a mobile specific role because we needed to figure out what was going on with mobile. And there were a lot of interesting things that came out of that. But what I guess I realized at that point was that eventually we no longer had mobile PMs, right? We just had PMs that were doing stuff in mobile. And so this idea of like channels or technologies or things like that, I think really aren't, I guess the future of PMing is not specific to technologies. It's more about specific to how do we serve the customer? How do we solve their problems? How do we help the team make decisions? How do we do these trade-offs? How do we communicate and build alignment? Those are all things that I think product managers should be doing, regardless of the technology. And so we talk about like AI strategy. I think it's really hard to say what that would mean outside of a customer use case, right? I think ChatGPT is very interesting because, it's a research group that kind of came across a really interesting use case, and the technology was ready for people to kind of believe enough that the synthetic language was actually something that was worthwhile to interact with. And so that changed a lot of expectations in the way that people will end up dealing with kind of machine learning systems. And so I think there's pros and cons about that, right? It means that the expectations have gone way up because of this type of thing. But it also means that maybe application can be broader, right? Whereas before, if you wanted to talk to people that were doing machine learning for decades, like that's your fraud prevention group. That's probably the people that are doing spell checkers and autocomplete and keyboards. So there's all these people that have used these types of technologies for a very long time. Not this specific technology, but this kind of like family of technologies. And so I think that's the thing that we should always be aware of, is that there will be another technology that comes after this, or another kind of like really big R&D type of thing. We can talk about the specifics, and I think there's a lot of nuance that comes out of this. But I think at a certain point, it will become more natural for people to just kind of say, yes, there is a machine learning component to this system alongside this like heuristic-based code-based part of the system. I think we get a lot of like weird and interesting areas when it comes to code generation. What does that mean for like low code, no code type of stuff? But yeah, I'll pause there for a second. I think that like for me, when we think about strategy, it's really just about like, how are you making great decisions in between like two very good options, right? And usually very hard options. And so I don't think that the decision right now is like, should we experiment with machine learning or not? I think you should probably experiment with machine learning right now, and you should see what types of benefits you can get out of that. So yeah.
So you talked a little bit about, back in the day of being a mobile product manager, which I actually had as well. My first consumer products, we were testing the concept of mobile, right, or of the App Store, which is hilarious to think about now. Looking back on that and then now seeing where we are today, do you think that there is such a thing as an AI product manager?
I mean, I'm going to say something that I think gets very controversial, which is I think that there may be right now an AI product manager, right? I think there are times that I've had a title of like director of AI of something, and I was a non-technical person, right? So the focus for me was really trying to help bridge this gap of understanding between these highly technical topics and the way that we end up using them in products or in systems, and how do people deal with them, right? So I think like there's a spectrum of kind of, I guess, uncertainty about what is going on with the technology or the role that you're in. And I'd say on one end, we kind of have like super new technologies, which at a certain point, there was a web or a digital PM, right? And then there was like a mobile PM, and there's now like VR PMs. There's like all these like different things that end up showing up as like technologies that, because of the nuance around that technology, we don't know the rules yet about that technology. We need to figure them out. We're kind of like having to do some translation and find a shared language with our technical counterparts to be able to have good conversations. And so I think that's when you have the AI PM technically. Then you start to move into less uncertainty about the technology. Things are known, like there's an awful lot known about like interaction patterns for mobile phones, for example, now. And so from the standpoint of like a smartphone, there's a lot of, it's kind of like part of the way that it just works. And there's designers that are very familiar with it. There's engineers that are very familiar with building with it. There's lots of frameworks and technologies that help you build those things. And so I'd say those in that area, you're just a PM at that point. But then there's like the other side of this, where we end up having so little uncertainty in what we're building. These tend to be like certain types of infrastructure teams that I've come across where literally their job is to make sure the thing keeps running exactly the way it's running today and to fix any bugs that come up from that. And I would say in those cases, there's actually a no PM probably in that team, because they're not trying to like try to do something different. They're not trying to adopt new kind of interaction patterns. They're not trying to, build or use objective thinking to think about new things in the future. And so I think that's the spectrum that we end up dealing with. And so right now, because of things like machine learning, I mean, we've been there for a little while. It's just that now it's so much more interesting because of the technology capabilities that are starting to come out that there is the AI PM. But I would say, if you look at my background, there's a lot of like those types of terminologies, but it's just usually meant because I was working in fields that were earlier. And so I don't think it's a bad thing if you're called an AI PM right now. I would just say, like, if you're called an AI PM in like a decade from now, that's probably a bad thing, I would say. And it probably won't even exist. Like, it'll just be a product manager. And actually inside of most of like inside of Google, inside of like Facebook, you were just a PM, even though you were working with machine learning technologies, right? And so that's what I would say. Is like I think those types of companies realize that there's going to be there's a certain skill set, and it's about the role profile and the way that you end up doing your work, the types of things that you own, rather than the technologies that you're working with. And so I think that's what these companies kind of realize. And so I would just say, looking at them, I think long term, there's going to be a lot of AI PMs that are out there, but I don't think it is like a specific role profile. Like maybe the next question would be, what is so different about that role profile? Like, would it be a completely separate team? Like maybe it is because it's a product that's more AI focused. Or is it like you're doing completely different things, like than I said, like working with engineering and design and legal and privacy, et cetera. You're not working, like you're not creating PRDs or specs or work items and talking through a shared language. All that stuff is just the same. And so I don't know. I keep on saying that I don't think it's a separate thing because we're still doing the PM job. I think the question you could ask, and I see this asked a few times now, is like, what does a PM mean if everything can be generated? And I would say, like, have you read the PRDs that ChatGPT has put out? They're not very good. Like as a PM, I would say, like, I've definitely tried and I've experimented with that. I think it's really great for like ideation stuff. And we should talk about like how do PMs use this as a tool, but I don't think that PMs will be disappearing anytime soon. I think people will call them different things, like Airbnb. They'll put them in different organizations. And that's fair. Like that's true in almost every place that you go to as a PM. Sometimes you're reporting under the CTO, sometimes there's a CPO, sometimes you're like under a COO, right? And all of those things are valid. And they just have different kind of inclinations or incentives for the way that the PM should operate inside those cases. So that's what I was saying.
Nice. So you actually kind of started down a path that we're getting quite a few questions on.
Sure.
I'm going to combine two of them because you hit them both at the same time. One is, do you think that AI is going to replace PMs? But then that flows into a lot of people are asking for, do you have any tips or have you experimented with using AI to help in our product processes? So writing requirements.
Yeah.
Because that might happen in research. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I'm going to say right now, and I'm probably, again, this probably means I'm going to jinx myself and be completely wrong, but I don't think that AI is going to replace PMs in the next like 5 to 10 years at least, right? Like, I think the things that are interesting to me when we talk about like code generation services, so things like Copilot, I think it's like Replete's Ghost Whisper and those types of things. Like, I think we get into an interesting place where people that were probably like full stack developers, right, that went to a boot camp and they were just there to kind of churn out boilerplate code. I think that type of job ends up going away much faster. I think the PM's role in those cases is to really help disambiguate what we need to build. And that is a very hard job, right? Like the joke right now is, I think inside of the architecture world, I listen to a lot of like architecture podcasts because I think architects are kind of in a similar place to like product managers a lot of the time. And so like one of the things is like, well, our clients are never able to actually tell us exactly what they want anyways. So are we worried about them like just talking to a ChatGPT and getting what they need out of it? And it's probably not, right? Like I would say that product managers are there through like discursive kind of discovery, discussion, argument, trade-off, like type of stuff. That is something that I think is still kind of in the human domain. Like I would argue that real decision-making is still a human's domain. And so that's what I'd say is like, I don't think that's going to replace PMs in the near term, at the very least. I think it might change the way that we end up doing our jobs. And then maybe getting to the point of like, what are the things that we should be thinking about now, right? Like, I think when it comes to product managers, like the things that are really important are the relationships. And so I don't think it changes that, right? Like if anything, for people that are not able to write great emails that are very nice and they tend to be very curt and stuff like that, maybe there's like some modification of the way you end up doing, the way that you end up writing communications can be maybe improved, right? And that could mean something like a more advanced version of like Grammarly or something like that. But it could also just mean like, I need to take a different tone. And so like, give me analysis of whether this thing is actually helpful or not. Like, am I actually trying to move this discussion forward? And at a certain point, maybe you could even identify that, hey, there's an argument going on. You should just talk to each other, right? Like, so I think there's like a lot of stuff like that about like synthesizing language and understanding language that becomes very interesting as like a personal coach type of thing. I think a lot about like ideation. And so inside of my decision-making processes, I use lots of different types of like card decks. And so I have like a try triggers, user-centric deck, or like oblique strategies, or I've been playing around with like design fiction, which is another kind of like way to prototype concepts. But I use a lot of these cards to help me ideate and get more variance in the way that I actually think about things. And so I think like the way that I've used this is if I need kind of, I'm trying to think about what are all the problems that I'm trying to solve or the nuances of those problems, plugging into the system and kind of going back and forth and generating more of these things. It's still a lot of it is just kind of average, right? And mid when it comes to the way that it actually is generating stuff. But there are occasionally like little things that I'm like, oh, I didn't think about that, right? And so I think this idea of ideation and pushing you away from biases that you may have, right? Like it can start to like force you. And I think randomness does this as well through the card decks or whatever. I think user research does this as well. So I think it's like another one of those tools that you end up like using in your tool belt to like help expand the way you're thinking about things. Again, you have to like still be the person that knows to like throw away like at least half of it. When it comes to like the blank page problem, I think that's another one that's very interesting. So the idea of like, the reason why we have templates a lot of the time inside of the PM world is because we don't always know what to start writing, and we don't know how to be kind of like creating the right set of things to be able to have a discussion, right? I think we over templatize, and I think people end up creating like templates that are the maximal amount of template that they could create rather than the minimal one. But I think like there's something about that idea of like, how would I just get started with this? And as someone that like writes a lot of articles, and like I also write like science fiction and like role-playing game modules, like it's helpful to with the blank page to get that like started. Now, what's interesting about this, though, and someone else said this, and I totally agree, is like, if you're going to write an article about something, describe the article to one of these systems, and you can use Bard now. Okay, you don't just have to use ChatGPT, and you have it spit back to you like, what is the article, and you read it. And you go like, okay, I'm not going to write about any of this, because basically that was the average of the internet based on the time that it actually took in all that data, right? And so that's what I'd say is like, I think it's like still helpful to kind of understand like, what are the basics here that we maybe should reference in some way, but it's not going to be the thing that is going to be really like differentiated. And maybe that's why like I don't think PRDs in the near term at the very least will be written by these types of systems, because if you look at them, it's like, of course you should have login, and you should make sure you have a preferences set and all this type of stuff. And I'm just like, who cares? Like, this is not the important part of like us trying to discuss what is the product that we're actually trying to like sell to people and differentiate and actually make something new in the market. So those are the ways that I've started to think about using these systems is really through that.
So one that I want to kind of clarify just for my own knowledge. So when you talked about kind of using it to help you examine your biases. So are you basically taking like, say, a product idea and putting it into Bard and saying, how can this go wrong? Like what?
Yeah. Or, I mean, I think that's like great, right? Like saying, how could this go wrong? Or what are the problems that are here? Or here's some problems I'm thinking of. What are the ones I'm not thinking of? Right. Like even just the idea of like, how would you combine, like, how would this impact this type of customer? Right. Or what are some customers that might use this that I'm not thinking of? Right. And so you start to get in this realm of just like, what are the things that I'm not considering? Right. And there's a lot of different ways. I think like prompt engineering, the way it works today, is very specific. And I think with some of the stuff that's going on with just like the way that people will start creating very custom agents, you'll be able to put them into kind of like a state by which they will automatically start to provocate or ask these types of questions. And so that's what I end up using it for, is like, try to ask like, what am I not considering? Now, this is also why we work inside of teams, right? Like I would argue that the the reason why we talk with like an engineer and a designer, and again, I always include like legal and privacy and security and all these other people that end up being part of like the team now, right? And data scientists, machine learning engineers, people like that, right? Is because they also bring a different viewpoint that helps break down our biases. And so, and actually I have a whole talk about this idea of like the big problem with decision making inside of organizations. I say decision making like with scare quotes because I don't think people are really taking the time to have the discourse around decision making, which means that we consider and create options, we create criteria, we refine those options, and we have a big discussion about what is going on. And the reason why that's really valuable is because through that discussion, we actually make better decisions, right? So all the cognitive biases that we have as individuals, as like human beings, we end up breaking down when we actually work inside of a team. And so I think like long term, I definitely think that there will be what I'll call like mixed kind of human and machine teams that will be out there, right? And so right now it's a lot of kind of one-on-one use with these types of systems. But I could see in the future that, you know, whatever way you end up communicating with your team, there could be other agents that are there that have some type of, you know, like knowledge or expertise or even provocation, right? And I think there's some interesting like weird design concepts like animistic design and things like that I think start to come in here. But in the end, it's about this idea that like human beings are really good at certain things, and we're good at having that argument and like figuring out what is the best thing to kind of come out of here. I think agents can then add to that with data, with being able to do analysis, bring in other information that we're not even considering. I think the issue that we end up having, especially inside of like cultures that are very consensus driven, you end up having to make all of the humans happy. And I think that's actually a mistake. Like inside of the world of like really good decision making, you want to have as much discourse as possible. You want to collect a lot of information. You want to like kind of beat up all of the ideas that are in there, be very adversarial to them. And then what you want to do is you want to have a decision maker look at all of this information and say, this is the decision that we're going to make. And it could be a single person. Ideally, it's a single person or a small group of people that are actually making the decision. And ideally, it's the people that are closest to the decision. And so like, I think for those people, getting aid by these types of like autonomous agents, right? Like, is that decision maker being biased right now, right? Ends up being really, really helpful in some way. So I guess like that's the thing is like, I think longer term, it's still unclear whether people want companionship from these types of agents, right? Like, I think that's a big open question right now. But I think the idea of like these agents in a very specific role as like a tool, I definitely think will be coming about. And that's the way people use it today, right? Like almost everybody that uses these types of systems in like a regular basis, they use it as a tool. Not really, I mean, I've seen some people kind of have like more friendly conversations, but it's usually just like to get information in and out and to like work through things, right? And I mean, this is something that inside of engineering, they've been calling like rubber ducking for a very long time, right? And if people are not familiar with that story, it's about like an engineer goes into like an engineering director's office and like, I'm having this problem, I can't figure it out. And the director just says, okay, well, here's a rubber ducky. Why don't you explain because he was like busy or something like that. He's like, explain it to the rubber ducky. Person like starts explaining the problem to the rubber ducky. He's like, oh, you know, I suddenly realized what I need to do, right? So even just like having a conversation ends up putting your brain into a different mode where you see your ideas from the outside rather from the inside. And so I think like the idea of rubber ducking these types of conversations ends up being really interesting. And again, I want to be very, very clear. Like, I don't personally think that these systems are sentient. I don't think we're near like artificial general intelligence, but I do think that like, you know, we need to also figure out the language for this stuff, because we keep on saying things like think or know or explain or something like that, or trust. And those are things that really only humans can perceive because of the way that we do things. I think we need to come up with a different language. Like, I don't want to keep on having to say like calculate or even predict is kind of like, has like some like essence of this thing is like thinking about the future in some way when it's not, it's just calculating something. So yeah, anyways, I kind of went very far off, I think, on that answer, but that's where I think like the future will be with these types of agents. And I think that's where, as far as like teams and the way organizations work and decision-making, I think there'll be a big benefit to that.
Yeah. You talked about bringing legal into your kind of circle of trust when it comes to building products, and particularly in AI. There's definitely been a lot of conversations around data privacy and what we can do with AI in our products. We have a few questions in here about, first of all, how should we be leveraging these tools when we're working on products that have sensitive IP?
Yeah.
And then how do you think that plays into the way that our use of AI in our products will evolve?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not a lawyer, so this is not legal advice. I just want to be very clear about that. But I do think like there is a real issue that as you start to plug things into these systems, if you don't know what the policy of the terms of service are, there will be problems with that. Now, this is an issue mostly for like internal IT, HR, and other types of like ops groups have to figure out what types of exposures are they allowed to do. Because like, for example, like PII, you should probably not be plugging into these systems. Now, there's a lot of work that when we're training these types of models to either ignore or remove PI, like personally identifiable information, there's a lot of work that goes into that, right? But I would just say like, you should not be plugging your like customer databases into these systems probably, unless it's a private one. And even then, like, I think the problem will be is if this data is then used to train future models. And so if you own the model yourself internally, you can decide whether that's the case or not, right? When it comes to using, say, ChatGPT or something else, you cannot decide that, right? Other than if they give you assurances that's the case, or you have like an enterprise agreement or something like that. And so there's lots of problems with that. I mean, this is the reason why like some companies don't end up adopting certain types of like SaaS products, right? So I don't have a good answer for that other than you should be wary of the data you put into these systems because they could be used for training in the future. And so you just have to make sure like that it's the right thing. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry, I lost the.
That was mostly it. Of how, basically how we kind of think about how this is going to impact our products. I know that I've seen, I think about when GDPR came out, and all of a sudden, like a lot of, there were, of course, all European companies worked really hard to get products GDPR compliant. Some US companies did, but then for quite a few, even today in EMEA, you click on a site and it says, sorry, we can't help you because you're in EMEA. It feels like we're about to enter that same realm.
So I think that's like a good point. The whole thing about like regulation of data that is used to train the models, that is going to be something that I think is highly volatile for most of these companies. And the reason why is because, there is essentially a patchwork of kind of privacy laws. And it's not even just like, so like there's the EU, maybe the US, there's other types of like global kind of consortiums like the World Trade Organization, which has certain things about like IP. But you even get down to like a state level, right? Like certain types of facial recognition software is not allowed in Illinois. The CSPA, like the California one, if I'm blanking on the acronym, but the California one is going to be closer to GDPR, right? As far as like it's the way that it ends up legislating things. And so I think, my guess, and again, this is not legal advice, is more like, how do I think that product will be impacted by this? Is that the data that you actually put in your model to train it, and even if it's not that you're building like an entire foundational model, or even just like what we call now like a legacy, a very cute like classification model, for those things, or even like fine tuning a large model, all of those different cases, you will have to be very aware of one, how that data was collected and was it under the correct consent laws for that area? And then two, are you adhering to the way that those laws work over time? And so what that means is that I think in some cases, people can request that their data is removed from the data set of a model. And in those particular cases, right now, the only way we can deal with that is retraining the model. And so because of the timing for this type of thing, we may get into the state where it's like every model that exists everywhere has to be retrained every 30 days. And until we start building techniques that allow us to pull out certain data or the way that data impacted the way that model is actually being, I think it's a very hard place to be. Because anyways, I would just say like the most important thing right now for everybody though is to make sure the data that you end up using is actually under the correct consent consideration to be able to use as a training set for your data. And again, that is not a product manager's job. That is why you work with a cross-functional team that includes a lawyer. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I think just a bit of personal advice from me is make friends with your legal team and your 100%. Security team and your privacy team. The worst mistake you can make is trying to keep them out and then like bringing them in at the last minute, because first of all, they know stuff you don't. Second of all, they have the ability to just shut you down. So it's not worth it. And then actually they can add a lot of value to your process. So I
mean, and to add just like a little bit more to that, like the truth is that what they really are there for is to help you manage risk, right? So they have known issues that they know about due to precedent or law or regulation. And they're just trying to make you aware of kind of that risk. Now, there have been times that we've done things that have been a little bit riskier, not in my Google case, but like in other places I've been, where we've gone on a riskier side of things versus the idea of being completely safe. And so again, just like kind of the idea of working with engineers where they're like, this is a temporary thing for now, but we'll have to fix it later. There's the same thing when we talk about trade-offs with lawyers and privacy and any of these other groups that we end up completing. So that's the job of the product manager, is not only to manage all of the risk that's going on, but then to think about how we wrangle the uncertainty. And those are two different things, right? Risk is much more about known things. Uncertainty is much more about like, how do we become robust and resilient in an uncertain future? So those two things, that is a really hard job that a PM has to do. So that's what I've got.
Great. So you mentioned earlier that you don't come from a technical background. And I think that probably surprises
I do have an engineering degree, but I try not to be technical. Okay. So,
Okay.
And I also have an art background, a design background, but it's a long story. So yeah, what I say, to be very clear, is I don't think product managers should be technical. And
so for product managers who are not technical, there's obviously a lot of times when you look at like AI roles, or you look at just even a lot of product manager roles, there's a sense that like you need a computer science background. How would you recommend people who don't come from that engineering background get up to speed, and like how technical does someone need to be a product manager in this space?
Yeah, I mean, there's a TikTok clip of me saying this on a podcast, and it got a lot of hate from TikTok. So I don't know what the deal is with TikTok, but they feel like product managers should be incredibly technical. So, I think like the thing I would say is that what we're trying to find is actually a shared language with any of our counterparts. And I think in the case of engineers, it's the trade-offs around how they build something that is maintainable, will kind of meet the requirements that we want to have, or they'll help the customer in the way that we expect it to. And that also it just won't like fail in ways that we don't want it to, right? And so the shared language is actually not about telling them like, hey, you should use this model and you should do this type of thing. It's more about like, what is the environment or the way that we end up creating guidelines for how the system should work. And so usually that ends up being kind of like the specification of the PRD ends up being like, here's all the cases that we want to enable. Here's all the cases maybe we don't want to enable. And they're very specific. In the case of machine learning systems, right, is that because they're non-deterministic. Here's what I'd say is like, I think like, have deterministic systems that are written in code work perfectly all the time? No, there's lots of bugs, right? So like, how deterministic are they really? But I would say like in this case of that, when we train a model and we won't always know how it fails. And the other issue is that when people or attackers that are outside of your system end up abusing it in certain ways, you won't know how it will fail during that abuse all the time. And there's lots of techniques to try to figure that out, but you'll never have a perfect understanding. Just like we never have a bug-free software that we release. Right. And so what I would say is what really ends up becoming even more important right now is actually what are the values by which your organization makes decisions? And a lot of time we write these things down that are very pithy as values, like, the customer comes first or something like that. My question is like, what is the trade-off that you're going to make? And so I use things like even over statements as like a way to do this type of thing. But this idea of like, what are you trading off? Right? Like, are you willing to trade off things like responsible fairness, but reducing bias over revenue? And I think that's the question you should be asking yourself. Like, where are the hard lines for your organization? And then those values end up helping you create the way that the system actually ends up kind of getting not only trained, right? Like, what data do you use? How do you train it? How do you test it? But then also, what types of things do you do to like monitor it and make sure that it's actually not harming people in a way that you think is really bad, right? And so that's, I think, the way that we end up talking about this is, I think most ethical or moral decision making, especially in product, comes from a set of values. The problem is that most of the time, real companies don't, like Google has like a set of AI principles that we adhere to, right? I think every company needs to really think about this ideal of like, what are the values that you're trying to kind of believe in, and how are you then using that to make moral and ethical decisions, which then lead to product managers making good decisions day to day in those trade-offs. And so that to me is actually the part that, I mean, I was joking with one of my old managers just about like, what is the right degree for a product manager? And I wonder if it's like philosophy, because a lot of the time we're talking about these like trade-offs that are really, really hard to make. And so from my perspective, I've very rarely met an engineer that if I ask them like, what is going on with this, and they want to explain it to me in a technical way, that's fine, and I will try to understand. But at the same time, like, they don't want me to tell them what to do from a technical standpoint. What they want me to tell them is like, what is actually necessary here. And so the work I would do at on the Portal device at Facebook Reality Lab, we would talk an awful lot about for like facial recognition to be able to like unlock the device that you were in. We would talk an awful lot about like, it wasn't so much about like how many lumens were in the room or, what was the pixel size of the face and, like all these different things about that. But it was more about like, let's just talk about like what is acceptable as far as like false positives and false negatives, right? Which is kind of, I would say is like a statistical term, but it's one that you can grasp, which is like, when are the times that you want it to think that it is the person, but it's not? How often is that acceptable, right? And what are the hazards when that happens, right? Versus the other side, which is like, when do you want this to fail when it is actually supposed to be that person? And what are the hazards or problems that come up from that? That type of discussion is way more important to the engineer, in my opinion, than me telling them what type of model, how we do face templates, like all this different type of stuff that ends up being hyper technical, right? So I think that's my point about almost any technical field, is that there will be experts, right? I work on a team where there are people that, even PMs that have like PhDs in like material science, okay, are not always considered technical enough. And so I would just say like we're playing the wrong game if we're trying to be technical, right? And so having a discussion about who is the customer, what is the problem we're trying to solve, what is the shared language to talk about the trade-offs around those types of things, I think becomes most important. And it's not something like where, again, I think when people talk about like technical PMs, they mean that we should be able to like do SQL to get, like pull out data. And it's like, well, you should have a data scientist to actually do that, because you're going to make a lot of errors in the way that you end up creating that data. And so anyways, those are some things I would just say. And I realize that this may be divergent from some of the community, but I really strongly feel that for those non-technical PMs, we would be benefited by them being there, because they think about things differently and they will actually go after the harder questions, which is how do we make this product great for people, rather than trying to build something that's really cool technically.
Yeah. As a non-technical PM, I co-sign this message. I'm from an MBA background to the
Fair enough, yeah. Well, and I don't have an MBA background. Like I actually have an engineering degree in school, but I sold out immediately into program and product management. So,
nice. And in fact, I know that I've seen actually the opposite happen, where someone comes from engineering into product and they can't let go of the technical details.
Right.
And like, that's not our job anymore. Like,
and that creates a lot of problems with your team, right? Is like your team wants to be like, inside of this cross-functional team, everybody should be an expert in something, because it helps pull us like the tensions within these teams are actually the most important thing, because when we have tension, we have like harder conversations about what's really matters. If this is the reason why, like actually very early on in my career at Microsoft, we had program managers, which were kind of like half project, half product managers. And I've seen other people give talks about this, but like, I don't think that should be the same person, right? There should be this like spectrum between risk reduction, which is project management, right? And then this idea of like kind of uncertainty maximization or wrangling, which is product management. And they should work together, but they should be pulling on each other. And we're somewhere on that spectrum. Like in healthcare, you may be much more on the risk reduction side, but on a startup, you may be much higher on the innovation side. And so from that perspective, like we should always be having these tensions inside of teams. And if everybody's just technical, you end up just building something that's for you, and that usually is not the right thing. Because yeah, that's what I'd say.
Great. So we had a question from Lauren saying, for people who are developing AI and ML driven products or features, there's kind of a tension that may happen when talking to stakeholders, which is by nature, AI and machine learning is not a linear path. And so you're kind of testing a hypothesis, trying it out, seeing if it's going to work, and then refining the model. But then when you're talking to your stakeholders who are asking when this is going to be done, it sounds flaky to basically say like, hey, we're just going to test it and see what happens. How do you manage stakeholders who don't quite understand that nonlinear complex path of AI development?
I mean, I think the problem is because we're trying to learn by building the entire system a lot of the time. And what they want to see is they want to see the final system. The work that I did at Philosophy was focused an awful lot just on even understanding, would the people that we're building this for, would they want this type of system or not, right? And would they be able to understand what's going on? Would they trust the system to make the right decisions? And would they be able to intervene when appropriate? And you can do all of that testing, by the way, without building a single machine learning feature. And so I think that's one of the things that we end up like getting into that's problematic, is that we end up trying to, again, build the whole system rather than something like testing individual things that help build a knowledge about whether this is worthwhile or not. And so I would give an example that like the startup that I ended up running was something called Complete Seating, which was like an open table competitor. And we were one of the first to like offer text message confirmations, which would reduce like no shows. It would increase cancellations, but it was much easier to manage your book that way. The other thing we end up doing is what we would refer to as like a dynamic book. And so this was, rather than having like a bunch of specific slots for this time for this party size, which is what OpenTable was doing at the time, we would just say like, based on the utilization of this room, we would basically consider the restaurant as like a job queuing problem. And so inside of that, we started building very, like at the time, more advanced technologies to be able to, one, predict like how long you might be at a table, and then use the system of the restaurant to try to slot things in so that you could maximize the utilization of the restaurant. And this would increase like revenue, which is something that's really important for restaurants. The problem we had, though, is that when we were building out a lot of this stuff, we tried to take over too much of the host job. And we were wrong. We were right about 90% of the time when we got into restaurants, but that 10%, we lost an awful lot of trust. And so we didn't even know necessarily what were the things that we should be taking on versus not. And again, like we did a lot of like iterative development, and I think we did a great job. We were like a continuous deployment type of place. So there was a lot of stuff that was going into like this. We definitely tried to do the best job we could, but we still made the mistake that we were trying to build this entire thing rather than trying to understand what are the things that actually matter here. And so I think that's the thing that like a stakeholder should actually want to know is, are we finding out whether this is a worthwhile interaction that people are ready for? And then what are the kind of parameters of that interaction that really matter to them? So in our case, like what we should have done first is actually just detect if they were making errors, which is that they were going to try to overbook certain things that basically would make a guest that showed up wait. And so we should have just had those error messages, and that would have got like, one, helped them an awful lot, and then two, wouldn't have put us in this position around that. So I think that's the thing that like when we talk about like building a machine learning system, we end up talking about, again, this whole system. Now, on the other side of this, there is an awful lot that goes into doing these things, right? Like with the newer foundational models that are coming out from a lot of different groups, there are lots of mechanisms for you to like fine tune it, or prompt engineering. I saw some people commenting about that. I think long-term prompt engineering ends up being too volatile for people to actually utilize. And I can talk about why later if people are really interested, but I think this idea of taking these models that already exist and then basically giving the data to that to fine tune it or to do something that is like very specific to your use case, I think is actually where a lot of smaller companies will go, or enterprise businesses that can't spin up entire like machine learning teams. And I think that's okay, right? Like I think they'll get an awful lot of use out of that type of thing. In those cases, data curation ends up becoming really important, right? Not only the consent collection type of stuff, but like, what is the right data set? Is this data set actually the thing that we think it is? And will it give us the right like kind of outcome? Beyond that though, like if you are a very large team that is building out this type of stuff and have started to build it out, I think maybe there's a mismatch of that stakeholder to understanding what actually is involved, right? And it is true, like, because it requires lots of energy, lots of water, lots of time, lots of data to be able to train these really large models. I think people are mistaking the fact that they can do it at a very small scale. There's different things they can do there, but I think that's maybe the problem, is there's a mismatch in understanding between what stakeholders think, like, say, Google or Facebook or, OpenAI or Microsoft are doing, right? And trying to now adopt that to a much smaller area where the reality is like, there's so much data that goes into these things. Like at Google, it's like potentially the entire internet is helping, at least the accessible internet, to be able to train this stuff, right? And so I don't know. I think a lot of the time, and I maybe I'm being a broken record here, is that this is not that much different than regular PMing. There's always a stakeholder that thinks that something should take less time. And so from my perspective, I think it ends up being an awful lot about how we doing these like experiments to actually prove that things are right, and then understanding what is the minimal thing to do and do that really well, and then expand from there. And that could mean, in the case of machine learning, that you use more simplistic techniques like linear regression, right? Or something like that, which is just like standard statistics. A lot of the time when people want machine learning, they probably just need standard statistics. And so that's what I would argue.
Yeah, I love the concept of like, people say they want AI or machine learning when actually what they want is like an if-then tree.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's called good old-fashioned AI, I think, is what we would refer to that. Like the idea of a decision tree. Definitely, that's machine. Well, it's AI. It's under the case of like expert systems and stuff like that. So yeah, sometimes that's all you need, right? Like if a human can't do it either, there's an interesting thing that happens there, which is that if a human can't do it, is it because the human is not able to discern the signal from the noise, which means that machine learning might be able to do it, or is a human not able to do it because there's just no data available to ever deal with it? Right. And so those are two very different cases. And I think people mistake one for the other a lot of the time, where they're like, a human can't do this. And so a machine learning system must be able to, when the reality is like, there is actually not enough data or any data that actually helps you do this today. And so a lot of the time when people are starting to build these systems, it ends up being an exploration in like, what information do we have to be able to then make predictions? And sometimes those predictions will not be good, right? Like I would say one of the things that we started to learn over the last little while is like, I used to work very long time ago with companies that would do like facial expression analysis to be able to understand emotions. And it's just been shown time and time again that emotions are much more complex than just what is shown on our faces, right? And this is different between cultures and ethnicities and just the way people look, like their facial structures, right? And so I think it's one of those things where sometimes machine learning just shouldn't be used, right? Or is not going to, it's going to give you a false sense of certainty about something when the reality is it's actually a bad use case for that. So like when it comes to like LLMs right now and their current uses, like web search, probably not that great for them. I mean, there's lots of people working on that right now to make them great, to be able to like point to, actual like web pages and pull from actual facts and data or other things that are outside there. But right now it makes up a lot of stuff. But that doesn't mean that it's bad for like writing, right? Or the blank page problem I was talking about, or ideation. Those are all cases where like hallucination, as we call it, is actually beneficial in some way. So I think it ends up being like, what are the use cases we're talking about here? And is it actually the right use case for the thing we're trying to do or not? And I think it gets back to kind of characteristics of the technology. And I've been kind of playing around with this idea of analogical innovation, which is how do we understand in these like technical, non-technical conversations, the actual like kind of characteristics of the problem and the solution we're trying to build, and then use that to find analogies in other domains to then basically like ask the technical question, what should we be using as far as systems? Because once you have those characteristics, you've disambiguated what actually needs to happen so that the engineer can move forward. And so like the example of that is like NASA tried to build a sail satellite that they had to launch into space. So it's something that's very two-dimensional that had to be folded very small. So they looked at a bunch of things, origami, and the field of origami ended up helping them build this thing. And so that idea of like analogy to creativity is actually really interesting to me. And I think could be used to have better technical and non-technical conversations, which I think most of my career is now. It's just managing and facilitating that conversation between highly technical people and non-technical people, basically.
I love it. I think we are basically at time now. So really just kind of any last words. I'll say my final question. If there's one resource or one thing that product managers who are just kind of starting to think about AI should go look at, where would you point them?
I mean, I really think the one that I referenced an awful lot before I joined Google was the People Plus AI Guidebook. I think it does a really good job of talking about this. But I would just say that like going out and experimenting with these things and trying them out, right? Not believing that they're doing the right thing, but just trying it out and like, what is a question you have right now, and ask it and see kind of how bad or good the answer is. So I think the pair guide is great. And that's why I wanted to get so involved in it. And like, I'm trying to help and contribute to it as well. But I think in general, it's just like, try these things out. I think the thing that ends up happening for people when they try this stuff out is there's like honeymoon phase where it's like, wow, this is amazing. It's like synthesizing language. I never knew a machine could do that, or a computer could do that. And then after a while, you're like, actually, this is not giving me the best answers in the world. And that's okay, right? But I think a lot of people have to get over that like hype peak to really start to understand how to use them in some way. So just try them out and use them, try to use them consistently, try to try them out inside the processes that you have. And just realize again that this technology is changing so fast that we don't even know what the real use cases are for this yet. It's like, again, going back to the mobile analogy, when iPhone first launched their store, there were a lot of like apps that were like fake lighters and then like pretending to drink something, and like the slot machine for choosing a restaurant from forget what the company was, Urban Spoon. But like we're at that stage right now for a lot of these things. The next actual wave is going to be when we start to integrate them with products that solve real human problems and actually aid humans in a big way. So that's coming up, is what I would say.
So where would people find the People Plus AI book?
Yeah, if you just go and search pair guidebook is pretty easy to get there. I can also like publish the link in the
I
in the
see
chat.
we've got people in the chat that are dropping the link.
Cool, yeah.
So we will also make sure we
But
include
yeah,
that
the
in.
reason why I think it's really great is it just really talks about kind of like for these different types of systems, how is it that people interact with them? And I think that's the part that like product managers need to talk about, that trade-off, because it's not just about the technical side, right? It doesn't matter how great the technical thing is. It's how do people interact with these systems. And so I think it's a great starting point for that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was a really great discussion. For everyone that's here, as I mentioned, we will send out the recording of this afterwards. We also have another AI conversation coming up in December. I am just working to finalize that guest. I think it's going to be really great. I'm excited about the person I'm talking to. So keep an eye out in your email and we will let you know when that's scheduled. Thank you again, and we will see you all next time.